The endgame of Borderlands is pretty solid. There are plenty of different bosses and raid bosses for players to farm for a chance at the rarest loot. However, it's not a secret that the Borderlands farming and the Borderlands endgame can sometimes feel unrewarding, pretty repetitive, and ultimately not that much fun. It can get very dull after a while. So today's issue is farming in Borderlands 2 can be unrewarding and repetitive, which of course isn't very much fun. Hopefully the solution is the addition of dungeons, which is some endgame content. So, looking at the current farmable options in Borderlands, we have named bosses and mini-bosses and enemies. Now, don't really have a gripe with how this is working currently in Borderlands. Different bosses have different drops, like Doc Mercy or the Bunker, and they're farmable to players at endgame who are looking for versions of loot that they want. The next option is raid bosses. And this one I don't so much like as I like the previous one. I think sometimes raid bosses can be very unrewarding, and if you've farmed Pete or Hyperius for any length of time, then you'll know that they aren't the most rewarding bosses considering their difficulty. Now, Pete's not a very hard boss, but Hyperius can be pretty challenging, especially if you're solo. I'd like to stress that I don't have an issue with the bosses themselves. I think the mechanics are okay, especially the Ancient Dragons of Destruction. I thought that was a great fight, especially with 4 players. But I believe they're kind of unrewarding because it isn't an easy fight, especially for the dragons, of course. So the main issues with these options that we have right now is that there's a lack of drops and drop improvements, and really a lack of variety. So the solution, I believe, is, like I said before, dungeons, but as well as an introduction of better drop rates and, of course, the loot system I devised in my previous episode, I think episode 2, would help with this as well. So dungeons are basically an idea I've had for a repeatable quest, I guess you could call it, through a linear area with plenty of enemies and loot. Basically, endgame players would farm dungeons for a chance at the best loot and a chance to upgrade their character to get slightly better versions. And one thing I'd like to touch on is a lot of my opinions derive from how Borderlands 1 was handled. When you farmed Nox's Armory, there was always a way to get better loot, and I constantly find myself finding better guns just by a little bit, better rolls, and sometimes even guns I've never seen before, and that's something that's really cool. So dungeons, like I said, would be like a repeatable area, and they would feature different things like enemies and bosses, objectives, and I think the best way to really compare this to something already in Borderlands would be the raid on Digistruct Peak. Now, the raid on Digistruct Peak was actually a lot of fun. I thought it was cool, and it was a great way to introduce OP levels, but it wasn't the most rewarding thing either. Obviously, you could farm it for the bosses who dropped things like, I think, Dunkino's mom and Saturn and stuff like that, but it was the same area over and over again, which is something that dungeons would change. I think using a system like the Chalice dungeons from Bloodborne could introduce a procedurally generated or a randomly generated version of dungeons each time. Hopefully I'm not completely butchering Bloodborne. I've actually never played the game. This is just stuff I've read about how Chalice dungeons work. So dungeons in Borderlands would be a procedurally or randomly generated area that players would fight through with different spawns of enemies, different mini-bosses, maybe some type of puzzles, hordes, different objectives, stuff like that. I think the objectives would be really cool, especially like defeat this boss, or protect these loot chests, or get X amount of kills with SMGs, or do some activity. In this way, I feel like they'd kind of be like raid-esque, like in Destiny, having small objectives that teammates have to work together to finish, but this, of course, is all just speculation. I think one of the most important parts would be to make it feel like Borderlands, complete chaos all the time. And this would especially be relevant if we implemented horde-type waves in the dungeons, and you go through and there's just enemies everywhere, and you and your team are just fighting through tons of different enemies. Another comparison I can give are the Destiny strikes. Obviously, they'd be quite a bit different, but basically having a farmable quest or a mission that you could do with your friends would be something that I'd really like to see in Borderlands, because I actually really enjoyed the Destiny strike system. However, what I didn't like about Destiny strikes were that they were pretty repetitive. It's the same strike over and over again. So hopefully introducing a randomly generated or procedurally generated type system would minimize the amount of sameness in Borderlands dungeons. Another thing I'd like to touch on is the end game of Borderlands can be quite frustrating if you're a solo player, and this is where I'd like dungeons to step in. I think that the difficulty should be such that if someone were playing by themselves, the game is totally okay and they can complete it themselves, but when they're playing with their friends, it doesn't feel too easy. Also, I'd like to add that a difficulty slider or a system of adding more difficulty for players who really want a challenge would be cool. Now, I don't really mean OP levels in this regard because I believe everyone should play at the same max level, but adding extra difficulty when setting up a dungeon or something like that would be pretty cool for players who really want the extra challenge. And obviously it would reward better loot. Which brings me to the next point is that dungeons have to be rewarding. It's the end game content of Borderlands, and hopefully this will be one of the main things that players are doing at end game. Going through these dungeons, players are going to be fighting through waves of enemies, different mini bosses, completing objectives, different chests, maybe secrets or stuff like that. And at the end they would fight one really hard boss. Maybe kind of like a raid boss, but not necessarily like a raid boss. And obviously, randomly generated things like this are not easy to complete. I recognize that. There would be a sameness in each dungeon, but minimizing that amount of sameness would be obviously the objective. The last thing I'd like to add is that these dungeons would obviously range in terms of difficulty and completion just based on the fact that they're randomly generated. So some dungeons would just randomly generate more enemies than other dungeons and would be harder for players, which this gives an interesting twist on an endgame because it's not always the same thing over and over again. Additionally, this would widely vary the amount of time needed to complete dungeons, and I was speculating on how long it should take to complete. So I guess for 4 players on the easiest generated dungeon, if they got lucky with their RNG on the generation, then maybe up to 15 minutes. But this could range all the way to like an hour, and this would be on the easier difficulty for 4 players, because obviously RNG would be different every time. Of course, I say 4 players because it's the current amount of players in a full lobby, but this would all depend on how many players are in the next game, the next Borderlands lobby style, maybe 4 to 6, 4 to 8. We don't know what Gearbox is going to do in terms of that. Tying back into a video, my previous video, episode 2, I believe it was. This is really the area for players to earn those higher level rarity drops. Like I said in the loot system, there would be forbidden or the red drops, and of course pearlescent. Now I believe that these dungeons would be the place to earn those. The bosses would be hard at the end, and it would be a lot of grinding, but this is where you get those drops. So to sum up, the addition of dungeons to Borderlands would increase the longevity of the game after completing the story missions and after reaching max level. Dungeons would be like a raid on Digistruct Peak mixed with the Bloodborne-esque Chalice dungeons, procedurally generated content, and randomly generated content. They would feature tons of enemies, mini-bosses, waves, hordes, objectives, and of course a last boss. They would be somewhat linear areas that players would fight through with their friends. The difficulty would be variable and would increase or decrease the loot drops. The most important part, and I can't stress this enough, is that dungeons have to be rewarding no matter what. This is going to be the end game of Borderlands, and it needs to be rewarding. I can't stress that one enough. So I hope you guys liked the video today. If you have any feedback about dungeons or other ideas for end game content, totally put that down in the comments. Talking about my channel next, everything's going well. I'm trying to do videos every day or every other day. And I might get around to streaming on Twitch eventually, so I'll put my Twitch link in the description. I can stream from my Xbox, so I don't really have any problems with that. Anyway, guys, if you want to see more content like this one, just go ahead and hit that subscribe button and keep an eye out for new videos. I've been Jeromo. I'll see you guys next time.